My name is Lisa Wexler, and I'm one of 3 PIs on this, and one of a number of us who have been shaping this study on Alaska Native community resilience. So I was planning on just giving a brief overview of the folks that are on the call, give them a chance to introduce themselves a little bit more fully, and to just talk about their role. We've got Carol Murphy, who is our community coordinator, CHarlene Apk, who has been involved in our research steering committee, Jim Chaliak, who has been involved in doing interviews, and then Jim Allen and Stacy Rasmus are the other PIs on the project. I'm happy to talk about any part of this process. It's very collaborative. Even just how to negotiate between 3 PIs is a process worth talking through with other researchers if you're interested in that. But I'm going to just pause and let Carol introduce herself, then Charlene, then Jim. And I'm going to mute myself while I guess I should actually introduce myself before just introducing the talk. I've been doing research and social service work in Northwest Alaska for 25 years. Did my dissertation there on suicide prevention in response to community requests for that work. And I've been working in collaboration with communities, using research as a tool to better understand, strengthen, advocate for wellness and positive social change. So that's my bio, and I'm gonna now mute mine and hand it over to Carol to introduce herself and her work on this project and what brought her here, then Charlene, then Jim.
Hi, good morning. My name is Carol Murphy. I am the outreach coordinator for ANCHRR. I've been involved with ANCHRR for about a year and a half now. My background is with student services at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I've been here for 20 plus years. I'm Inupiaq from ARCUS, but been residing in Fairbanks, Alaska with my family. And I'm really excited about this work I've been doing. It's new for me. The research world is new. I'm learning a lot, but it's very important. And I am just excited that we're doing work that brings hope to people. And yeah, so thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jim. Chaliak is, I'm Yupik, and my first language is of course Yupik. I grew up in the village of Nunapitchuk, but have lived in Bethel for many years and now in Anchorage for a couple. I'm a graduate. I got a certificate in Rural Human Services in 2016 after a completing the 2-year program. So now in advancing these studies, I moved right along into the AASW program as well and completed that after that, the RHS. So since last year, I've been enrolled in the BSW portion of the program. So all of these studies are in relation to Alaska Native cultures and gaining expertise and knowledge in social work right along with it. So the interesting part of that is the program incorporates elders and invites and have elder presence in each and every class. So, and that's a really big part of that program. I think is really it works well into the program. So in this study, I'm really happy to be part of it as far as working like at ground zero with folks that we're calling individually. So I'll be reporting a little bit up on that for you. Thank you.
Ukla Lotuk, that's good morning in Inupiaq. Again, my name is CHarlene Apk, and my Inupiaq name is Akpik, which is cloudberry or salmonberry. And I've worked on the research steering committee of this project, and then I'm also transitioning into supporting as a research assistant. So I did my master's at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in rural development with an emphasis on circumpolar health. And that's actually where I met Carol. And then I work as a researcher at Southcentral Foundation here in Anchorage, and I'm a doctoral student in the Indigenous Studies PhD program at UAF as well.
Thank you all. And so I was going to just take a little time and introduce the project overall. We were gonna hand it to each other as we go so that you can hear more than just my voice. But if you have a question, I don't know, Meredith, can they put a question in chat and then will we be able to see it? Is that how it goes?
Yes. So I would invite anyone who has a question just to type it in the chat and go ahead and send it to everyone. And there should be an orange thing that pops up on your screen. If you can't see it during the presentation, I will either let you know or we can hold it to the end.
Okay, that's terrific, because we really want to make this interactive. There's not a ton of folks on the call, so we would really like your voices engaged in the conversation. So please feel free to do so. Okay, so I'll just do a quick introduction. The Alaska Native Collaborative Hub for Research on Resilience has several different goals that are complementary to each other. So one is to really be collaborative, to try and do work that speaks to all different sorts of people across the state of Alaska, that helps to advocate for community needs, to really focus on community strengths, to do capacity building whenever we see possibilities for doing so, and to have Alaska Native leadership at all different levels. And so our project has an executive advisory board that meets at least once a year. We've been actually asking more of them than that. And they review what we're up to from a really high level. They're generally people that are leaders throughout the state. And they can sort of see the work that we're doing and how it might fit into their work and how we might make it better and more responsive to their needs. We host every year a collaborative hub meeting, which involves people who are doers or people who are really engaged in wellness activities in their own communities. And that can be formal people that are in RHS, that are rural human service providers. It can be people that are working outside of those formal systems, just people who are elders, who are looked up to, who have skills in different ways. So we invite lots of different people to come together at those collaborative hub meetings, to hear from each other, to talk about what is both creating and sustaining wellness in their communities. And then we have a really focused research steering committee that Charlene has been a part of, and that really looks at the study that we're doing that I'll talk to you a little bit more about today. That tries to focus on strengths, what's working in communities throughout Alaska, and we really focus on 3 regions, so Northwest Arctic, Bering Strait, and the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So there's 65 communities that we're working with within those 3 regions, trying to really focus on what's working, how communities have negotiated different systems that help support young people. So those are cultural systems, those are service systems, those are political systems and self-governance systems that are all working to support wellness in the young people that live there. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that study. And by way of just giving you a sense of what that involves, not only does that include coordination across those different groups of people and those different constituencies, but also across 3 universities. So we have institutional review boards at those universities. We have Alaska area institutional review boards, and then we have tribal reviews. And so those are a lot of different kinds of reviews that are involved in the work that we're doing. I'm going to hand this over the next couple slides to Charlene, who can talk about ANCHRR from a different perspective. who was part of the planning of this year, who was really involved in leading this last hub that we just had in Nome. So I'm going to hand that over to Charlene.
Yeah, so this is a slide on our collaborative hub. So again, although we're working in different communities in certain regions, which we'll show you, this is a statewide initiative, and the hub provides that space for all Alaska Native people to come together on this topic because it's so important to our communities across the state. So we have the goals here, and I won't read them off, but I will emphasize the second bullet, which is focusing on the strengths of Alaska Native people, culture, and communities. And so again, we're trying to, and we'll again describe a little bit more of how we're measuring this, but we're really trying to work off of the strengths of our people, as culture is a foundation of our wellness. And so we're trying to highlight that and promote what we're doing well. One of the things that we talked about a long time ago is we're trying to protect the protective factors. And that's I think a entryway into understanding our effort on ANCHRR. And the other thing that I think is important to share with this group is it's not an intervention. Again, in research, we are so used to a very linear way of approaching research, but we'll share again a little bit more what we're doing, but we're really trying to identify our resiliency and our strengths within our communities so we can promote those to protect our youth. And so the hub brings people from across the state together. The first year it was held in Fairbanks, and this last one, what month is this? It goes by so fast, is it March? We hosted it in my home community in Nome, Alaska, which is by the Bering Straits. And we had people from the local communities and people from all over the state who are promoting wellness in their own ways in their communities come together and learn from one another and share what we're doing. You can go to the next slide. I wish I had a pointer. I don't think you can. But so this is our state. For some of you who are maybe new to our community, we have over 227 federally recognized tribes. So it's almost half of all of the US tribes just within our state. So we're very, very diverse. And then the regions that we're working in, those 65 communities, are Inupiaq and Yupik communities. Yay, there's a pointer, which are along the coast there that Lisa was pointing to. The other thing is we have over 20 language groups. So for example, even in the Inupiaq region, there's 8 different styles of speaking just that one language. So again, I just want to highlight the diversity amongst our communities and how much cultural richness we have to work off of for this study.
Thank you, Charlene. That's great. So I'm going to jump in and going from this like beautiful one to this one, less beautiful. But what we're trying to do in just pointing this out is there's been so much research that's looked at suicide risk and suicide risk factors. And oftentimes when we talk about Alaska Native and Alaska Native American Indian groups, we conflate difference in order to say, on a population level, which is true, suicide rates are much higher. There are health disparities, so they're higher than when we look at other populations. And that is true, but partly what that does is that reduces the complexity and it doesn't allow us to see the strengths. And so when we look at it per region even, we see huge differences. So this slide was done by Jim Allen, who again is one of the PIs. And it just shows that there's huge diversity in even just looking at that population statistic of suicide rates. And again, per 100,000, which is a tricky thing in places that have 10,000 people in a region. So it's a tricky business. It doesn't always fit. But it also obfuscates some of the strengths and some of the ways in which communities really are managing the risks that have come with colonization in ways that are creative, in ways that are sustaining, and in ways that other communities can learn from. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. And so we're focusing in on the 3 regions, not necessarily because they have the highest rates of suicide in the state. Actually, it just ended up that both Jim and Stacy had been working in Yupik in the YK region for many, many years with Jerry Mohat and many other collaborators in that region, Billy Charles. And I've been working in Northwest Arctic and more recently in Norton Sound or Bering Strait, over the past few decades. And so when we looked at the call for collaborative hubs focused on suicide prevention, we were like, well, let's work in the regions that we've worked in the past because we have relationships and we have some ideas of what communities might be interested in looking at. And let's really try and address some of their questions, some of the ways in which communities are already doing things that reduce suicide risks. Because within these 3 regions, there are actually 75 communities, but only 64 or 65 have 100 or more people, which was the way that we are thinking about doing this research. And so can we look at those communities, can we work with those communities to understand what's happening within them that's working to protect young people?
Lisa?
Yep.
We have a question from Dean, and he asks about, he notes that cultural boundaries cross national borders, and is there ANCHR collaboration or information exchange with Canada and Russia?
That's a great, great question. So not formally, but definitely informally. So I have met with folks out of McGill and the University of Montreal who have been working with different communities in Canada, and they've done some similar work in looking at community protective factors, and we've been trying to inform each other, learn with each other. We definitely invited them to the Collaborative Hub. We're working to sort of make that happen in the future. Not so much with our Russian colleagues, I'm afraid, but some of this work we've also presented at the Arctic Council meetings on what do they call it? They call it mental wellness in those contexts. And so we have actually been trying to figure out how we can work together, how we can inform each other's work as we move forward. Iceland is the new chair for the Arctic Council's work, and mental wellness, that working group continues as part of the sustainable working group. And so some of those conversations have continued there. Rhonda Johnson is doing her Arctic Fulbright there now and is making some of those bridges more apparent for this next chairmanship. So I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Can I, this is Sarah, can I jump in with a follow-on question to that?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. So I'm wondering if there's a, has this been presented or shared with the International Arctic Science Committee, the social and well-being working group of that committee, which would cover all 8 Arctic nations?
No, it has not. So it's the International
Arctic Science Committee. I'll follow up with you because I think this would be, I think that they're doing some similar work. So yeah, I'll follow up directly with you. I'll put it, yeah, you'll get an email from me.
That's great. Thank you. That's terrific. I mean, we're very open to learning from other people who have done this before. We're open to incorporating all kinds of new perspectives and voices. And so thank you. That's great. So I was just going to quickly walk down what our specific aims were for the project and really want to get to the place where both Charlene and Jim can sort of tell you how it's been working. These specific aims were written, you know, with some community input just from those years and years and years of collaborative work. We put together our best guess for what we were going to be doing, and then those aims have shifted as we get more input from our different constituents. So these are the aims that we have been pursuing. So aim 1 is really at a community level, what are associated factors that we can identify at a community level that are associated with reduced suicidal behavior and other adverse behavior. And we're getting those from state databases. We've also done an administrative supplement to see if there are ways to identify some of those factors, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, through data that's already being collected at the state. Our second aim is to really look closely at how those factors are working within communities and in the lives of youth. And then our third aim is to develop a tool that can be easily accessed, that can be used by communities to begin to think about some of these factors and how they're working in their villages, and to also share ideas across communities for how they can strengthen, support, sustain those protective factors. So we started off with the idea that we would be building on Chandler and Lalonde's research. This is a really often cited research. There's definitely been critiques that we have been trying to work towards addressing in this work. But what they did was, just to put it really quickly, is they used only administrative data, so they didn't talk to people within communities, but they looked at administrative data to figure out if these factors, and you see them listed, so self-government, land claims, education, health services, if these things were in place in communities, and if they were, how they were associated with suicide rates. And that's all they looked at. They looked at sort of whether or not these factors, really crudely assessed, were associated with a reduction in suicide rates. And what they found, oh, sorry, I'm going to tell you the answer. What they found was, yes, there did seem to be an association between these factors. So the more factors that were in place, the lower suicide rates these communities tended to be. Again, I want to just emphasize community level versus population level or regional level, which is oftentimes how suicide is studied. So we looked at that. We just did a pilot with some of the communities that I collaborate with, and we tried to translate this in also another really crude way to, okay, so what would these factors that they studied in a Canadian context look like in an Alaskan context? So we talked to people in 8 communities in the region just to see, were cultural activities being done? Did people feel like there was adequate health care that they could access and utilize? So these are the factors that we did just as a pilot, just to see if we could begin to assess some of these factors on a really crude level. And we did find some associations, some things that made us want to do a better job the next time. And so that's what this study is doing. The study is saying, so if we were to look at protective factors within communities, what would those look like? And so when we proposed this, we proposed to look at these protective factors. So we looked at services, and we broke them up looking at education, health, social services, and justice. We looked at things like community development. So how were organizations within communities working together? Did they have any formalized structures to sort of share information, those kinds of things? We looked at local control, self-determination, tribal ordinances, and how they were followed through with. And then we looked at cultural continuity in a couple different ways. So this is how we wrote it up. And then we brought it to our research steering committee, who had a lot to say about how we were looking at these things and what was most important about them. So actually, a really important thing, I don't know if you caught it, but one thing that they thought was really important to add was spirituality and religion. And I guess I'm going to pause here because Charlene was a really articulate advocate for how we should be thinking about spirituality and reality and religion in communities and how it might really make a difference. I'm just going to pause for a second and see if Charlene wants to say anything about that.
Yeah, so one of the things also about thank you, Lisa, that you just presented to share with the group as well, is how interconnected these things are in our cultures and in our communities. So we recognize that self-determination and decolonization and speaking our language and having access to our foods and all of these things are so interrelated. So that was very, very hard to, just to piece them out. And that was one of the biggest struggles when we know that spirituality and religion is a protective factor. It's also shown in research that it having some kind of anchor like that really is healthy for people no matter what it looks like. And one of the things on our research strength committee that we felt like that was infused in everything cultural that we do, that is spiritual practice when we dance and when we speak our language and when we're on the land. And so we were hesitant to piece it out because it is part of all of those things that we do in our communities, but we did want to give it acknowledgement and recognition and to really honor that piece. And so we had some very long, intense conversations to develop a measure for this. So putting it into the research context is very tricky, and it hasn't been done a lot in research for good reason. I'll say that, but we're trying our best. And so we're trying to develop a question to measure this in our surveys that both includes people's wide spectrum of spirituality and religion, but doesn't turn them away or make them feel excluded. So this was a very challenging area, but I'm really proud of our group for working together and getting this this space in there because it's just so important to our communities.
Thank you, Charlene. Yeah, and really hard to come up with how to tease it out of some of the other sections, like cultural continuity, that is spirituality. And so we ended up really doing a lot about how the coexistence of traditional spiritual practices and religious spiritual practices, and how can we ask questions about that. And Jim, who has been doing some of the interviews, might have something to add to that when we talk about what we've learned. So our hypothesis here is pretty straightforward, that when communities have these things in place, we imagine, and this is specific aim 2, that it is a signal that these community level mechanisms, or these ways in which communities have developed systems to support and sustain those factors, are in place, and that those things will work to reduce suicide risk for young people. So that's our basic hypothesis. And we have developed questions over the last, so we spent basically a year developing questions in ways that, as Charlene was suggesting, are in empowering. We wanted them to be a good experience for people who are both asking and people who are being asked about these factors in their communities. We wanted them to be not as much opinion as something that people would tend to agree at a community level, whether these things were in place or not. And we don't know how well we did on that. And really wanted to get to be able to capture both the diversity of the different communities, because each community is different. As we also mentioned, there are different cultures within those 3 regions. So there's a lot of complexities. So we wanted to make it so that the questions that we were asking fit all the communities that we were working with, and so 65 communities. And we wanted them to be specific enough so people had a definite answer. And that's a really tough thing to do as all measurement development. So we went through a process that literally took a year, and this is the timeline. Charlene was involved in all of these RSC meetings, as was Carol. And so I don't know, I'm going to hand it over to Charlene to just talk about those different steps that she was a part of, and then I can fill in the other ones that she wasn't.
Yeah, so part of developing this as well is we are trying to have this be an assets approach. And so even wording the survey in a in a way that, again, is positive and not deficits based. Again, in research, we're so used to, it's so easy to ask about deficits. So we wanted to ask things, ask community members about the landscape of their community and really make that clear that it's not, again, individual opinions, but we're asking people who are often also in leadership positions to give a good overview of their community from their perspective and engagement. But framing the questions in a positive based way can be very, very challenging sometimes. And then we also, I think as Lisa mentioned, we don't want the questions to be triggering for anything that might unsit well. And we also didn't want people to feel bad, for lack of better words, but for not, if their community for some reason, for many reasons probably, maybe didn't have some of these protective factors in place. So some of the verbiage that we went with from the research steering committee's feedback was things like, instead of just saying, no, we don't have that, we use words like not yet. So that makes a big difference in their ability to respond accurately to what they're seeing in their community. So just even small decisions like that, whether we had forced choice or no, or I don't knows, and what do we do with a lot of I don't knows, our research steering committee worked through that in all of these different meetings that you see here and coming together. And then I also just want to, I know Lisa said at the beginning, but we're giving a lot of information, but the research steering committee has a lot of Alaska Native leadership and Indigenous people in it from the communities. So just a little bit more context about who's giving feedback to these measurements.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And then we actually took some preliminary, our draft measures on the road, and we asked both RHS students to have a look at them. So those are people that are generally speaking from communities who are doing a week-long, and Jim can talk more about this because he's already been through this program, but they do a residency for a week a month where they come together to get their certificate, which is on the pathway to getting an AA degree in social work and then a BSW, and then they can continue to an MSW. So Jim is in the BSW part of that now. So we had their feedback. Do you want to say something about that, Jim?
Jim, you're muted. There should be an unmute button at the bottom left part of the screen.
How's that?
Yep.
It is working?
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you. The studies that I'm enrolled in right now are, I think they're very well designed as far as drawing interest and engagement from the students, especially in that even though we're there to learn, we are also offering what we know from our upbringing, our life experiences. So I really appreciate that part of it. And along the same lines, we have members in our cohorts that I'm finding that have real life experiences in their families around suicide, completed suicide, attempted suicide. So we get to see insights that way that may not be offered in any other setting, I don't believe, in a very good, effective way. So that's what I am appreciating, and looking forward to advancing in that area as well. So, but for this presentation, I'll be sharing of what I've experienced along with in the phone interviews.
Thank you, Jim. So one of the things that, as we were going through this, and it's not in this timeline, but one of the things that we've been trying to keep focused is capacity building. So if there are ways to engage people in thinking and doing the research, thinking about shaping and doing the research, we have been making that happen. And so that's one of the shifts that we had. We had originally planned on having graduate students at the University of Alaska Anchorage and Fairbanks doing the interviews using the structured interview. We've been calling it a survey. but it's done over the phone. And we had originally planned on having graduate students do that. With advice from the Research Steering Committee, we shifted to have our RHS students be doing those interviews as part of their practicum if they chose to. So that was another shift that we did according to the RSC. And, oh, go ahead.
Next slide.
Oh, next slide.
Oh, where did it go? Sorry, I thought that there was the next slide was the one on that specifically. But that's okay.
No, do you want to?
Yeah, so just to add to what Lisa and Jim are sharing is with the history of research in our communities and the continual healing of that relationship between our communities and research, it was really important that the people who are collecting the data, you know, on the ground, as Jim said, have that trust with our people. And so one of the that's part of the transition and one of the changes we made on this study that I'm really proud of the PIs also being so open to, because we're asking for things that haven't necessarily always been done, or it isn't the way that research expects it to be done. And so having the RHS students do this was a big change and a lot of work to train them and to get them all together. And but it's really amazing for our community members to be able to be called up by someone that they may know, or that, you know, is from the region, or they know is an Alaska Native person, and having that comfort. It's also really amazing to see this really be community driven and to be locally led. That's also something that I'm really proud to see. At the last hub, having Jim's panel share and have them, all of the RHS students up there, and just being able to see Alaska Native people lead the research on the ground and at every level was pretty historical and pretty amazing for our communities to see their own people be doing the work. So thanks.
Yeah, and so we have been trying to be really transparent, which makes all of our like slip ups or oversights really obvious. So it means that our egos have to be a little bit used to being challenged, which is actually really good for us. So I think one of the things that we've been doing is bringing the work back to the hubs each year to get their feedback and to help shape the next level of work. And so we brought the interviews, all the questions, we workshopped them at the Collaborative Hub meeting with over 100 people from all over the state to give us feedback. And this is just a selective quotes and ideas. People were curious about how we were going to actually create our deliverable. I'm curious about that too. You know, what is the toolkit going to look like? You know, how will it be useful? Really, people tend to appreciate the fact that we have Alaska Native people doing work with and for Alaska Native communities. There were some feelings that people might feel bad if there weren't as many protective factors in place. And so all of these things really goes to some of the ways in which we are trying to put into action and continually be reminded of what's important for our partners. And so this is one of the sheets that during our RSC meeting, we were like, can we just boil down to what we want to take into consideration and what we want to keep in the forefront of our mind? And I don't know if Charlene, you or want to say anything about these principles.
I'll just highlight honoring the stories. It's nice to see some familiar faces on the call. And one of the things, if you're able to visit our community and hear from our people, is we really honor story. And we practice that in a lot of different ways in research. Oftentimes we create that space for sharing story. We, as you saw, we give pretty thorough introductions so we know each other well when we enter this work. And so we practice that in research through different ways, because it's the ways that our communities want us to, and the way that we do things. So
great. Okay, so I'm going to just give a quick overview of how one of the shifts that we did to begin doing interviews was to shift from having graduate students doing the interviews to having RHS students who are beginning their academic pathway do the interviews for this research. And so what that did mean was a training where we brought RHS students together. Unfortunately, Jim was not part of that. He came on a little bit later, but we had 8 Rural Human Services students come in, learn about the research, get comfortable practicing doing the interviews, thinking about the roles and the boundaries involved with being a researcher, also being a student doing your practicum, and being a community member. All of those things could create some, I don't know, some thoughts or some tensions possibly. We had to think about supervision as far as documentation. We had to think about how to take the data, keep it safe and confidential in places where people don't have high-speed internet, where sending documents can be a real challenge, where we needed to make sure that we had stipends for the people who were doing the interviews tracked differently than the actual research itself to keep confidentiality. So there's a lot of logistics to making that happen. And then we had to do the CITI research ethics training online, which was a challenge, just in the way that that's written and the kinds of issues that it highlights isn't necessarily something that a lot of our students were familiar with in the past, or wasn't written in a way that was super clear. I find it really confusing myself. So, so we did a 3-day training to get folks up to speed. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Jim to just talk about his perspectives about being an interviewer. I guess to introduce, we have over 100 interviews done. Jim has done a lot of them. He's a star interviewer. So reflections from Jim.
Very good, thank you. Just as a side note, I'm really fortunate that having put so many years at YKHC, Yukon Kuskokwim Health Corporation, even though all those years were focused on information technology department, the confidentiality training has everything to do with the study as well that I got during those years with IT there. So this skill set and getting certified with CITI was really interesting as well for me personally, because it crossed over really well for me that way. So I just wanted to add that part in there. So back to the study about community strengths and resilience factors. As I make my calls, it's really interesting to see and find out what each individual's perspective has on our structured interview. I get a different answer pretty much on every call I make, but I can generalize. I started generalizing the differences between more by age and maturity as I make those calls. So on one hand, the older folks tended to identify more cultural aspects of their community versus the young folks that tend to have less knowledge about that. But then in somewhere in between, I'm also seeing those who have, even those the ones that are younger than me, have some understanding of their culture and are able to identify what they're seeing in their community as far as their own culture goes and what they thought about how their particular community and their village council and other agencies in their community work together, or they feel that they don't work together, or there might be miscommunication in between. So I'm seeing different aspects like that coming out of these phone interviews. So as part of the membership in the community in the community level, and as a student, I get to see and understand the language that Lisa and Charlene are presenting here. The language is I can understand it, and like it was pointed out earlier, it's very difficult to come up with the language to use in measurement. And I see and understand that as well as I'm making these calls, because on some questions, there's a long pause where my contact has to process that and see where he or she can line it up in his or her life in the village or in that community. So I'm beginning to see and understand where, yes, it's hard to, it can be difficult to fit this frame of mind and study to try and measure things in our communities, especially if there's a strong native cultural presence there, because as we're going along in a native community, one life stage is not necessarily treated by itself. Things are taught in that stage with an expectation that it can be applied in the next one, and so on and so forth. So it's a really huge picture and it's complex, like Lisa was pointing out earlier, very complex to see it that way. But for us as interviewers and members of the community, and coming out from this frame of mind and trying to help and understand, measure things like the study is attempting to, we're learning. I am learning, and I'm pretty sure our contacts are learning from this structured interview as well. As I'm asking these questions, towards the end, you know, I spend 25 to 30 minutes on each call. Even though my contact may have been a stranger to me, by the end of that call, we're able to laugh at the very last question. And that question is, which one do you identify yourself as? Male, female, or other? So more times and often than not, my contact and I just break out in a laughter, and we know what their answer is. It's going to be a male or female for the most of them. So that's how some of the interesting things that are kind of manifesting throughout this study for myself. And it really appears that not only am I getting involved with the study itself, but I'm also able to bring this, the idea behind the study into my classroom, and I'm able to frame some of my questions to my instructors in a way that may reflect the meaningful and a structured way that can be, I be able to draw out something out of the lessons that were being taught. In particular, interest is, this week we just started a summer class, and it's all on human behavior. And we're coming up with on a framing our behavior health study to include not just ourselves, but our environment now. So this study is going to be reflective of that frame of thought, is Alaska Native culture and wellness and preventing ways to prevent suicide. So really resilience factors is definitely related to our holistic approach. And I think it feels relevant that this study is going to pull out, even though it's going to be in segments, that it's really going to support in general how Alaska Native cultures have a holistic approach to them.
Thank you so much, Jim. So I don't know how long people can stay on the call, but we thought that there might be some questions, some things that people wanted to talk about. I know Charlene has to leave, but I'm open to another 15 minutes if people want to stay on. I don't know.
Lisa, can I just have just more of a comment than a question? This is Andrea. It's nice to see you, and Charlene, and Jim, and Carol. I wanted to just reinforce some of the items. I so appreciate hearing from Jim especially. I think that's a really important piece of the research. And what others on this call might not know, that ANCHR is part of a collaborative hub with 2 other research projects. But I think what's so special about this one is the emphasis on resilience and just the richness of the information that you all are getting, and the fact that even beyond understanding how this research might be helpful for Alaska Native communities, that the other hubs in the lower 48 are learning from you and applying some of the information that you're acquiring in the studies that you're doing. So I wanted to just make that as a general comment, how much we appreciate those efforts. And also, I think that the inclusion of RHS students in the interview process is brilliant. That's a real contribution to how this work can be done in other settings as well. So I really applaud you all for listening and taking that suggestion on.
Thank you. It's been great. And as Jim was saying, like, there's so many unanticipated positives, I guess, to doing that. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Are there other comments or questions? I think, you know, I think we presented very quickly, and we sort of presented like it was an easy process. Just did this and this and this and this, but lots of negotiation, lots of conversation in the process that might be interesting to folks who are doing similar work.
Lisa, this is Sarah Yoder. Thank you so much, everyone, for this very interesting talk. I actually think it sounds very complicated, not very easy, and I really admire the work you've all done. It'll be really great to see that toolkit, I think.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else have comments, questions?
Am I unmuted yet?
Okay.
I wonder.
Oh.
Yes, you just got unmuted.
Ah, excellent. I just wanted to let everybody know that I'd like to lend my voice to Andrea and say, you know, extend my heartfelt compliments for the very productive and innovative approach to community participatory research on this important problem. So thank you very much.
Thanks. So nice to get all these pats on the back.
They don't come regularly when you do research, so you savor the moment, perhaps.
I have to share them with my, colleagues that aren't here. All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. And thanks again to everyone. We have our next meeting is on June 11th for the Health and Wellbeing Collaboration Team. This is a One Health focused meeting. There is a link embedded into the agenda for those interested in signing up for the next meeting. If there's anyone that, as we've sat here and got to know each other a little bit, you're thinking about updates that might help support the Alaska, the Arctic Research Plan, feel free to reach out to either myself or Meredith or Sarah Bowden, and we can see if we can get you on the agenda for a future meeting. And with that, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.